Kia ora koutou, and thank you very much for that very nice introduction. I've got my phone up here, not so that I can Twitter from the meeting while I'm actually talking, because some of you will know I'm very keen on Twitter, but because it's the only timepiece that I own. So I'm just keeping an eye on the time. If you see me checking it, I'm not actually answering a tweet. Can I acknowledge, please, this union, this fantastic union? I have to say that now, don't I? Yeah. But regardless, it's been an absolute pleasure to work with the ASMS over the time that I was president of the Council of Trade Unions, and you've always been a great supporter of our work, and I've always enjoyed your conferences. I'm sorry I missed your party, because they're the best parties in town, but I was down at Pike River yesterday. So I've been asked to talk about my observations on the union movement and the work that we're starting to do at the Council of Trade Unions on the role of trade unions as public institutions. So recognising that we're actually important institutions in the civil society and trying to describe what that means and what that means in terms of special protections that unions should get. So as I say, I've just been to Pike River, it's the 5th anniversary. And every time you go back to that community, you reflect on your role in health and safety and in the deregulation of the New Zealand labour market, and what role you've played within the union movement and whether we ever did enough in terms of safety prior to Pike. You reflect on the role of the state, because the state has played, I think, a very poor role from beginning to end in the history of that mine and those people down there. And you begin to think about, unions generally and what they need to do to make sure that these sorts of things don't happen again. So the key reflections from Pike yesterday were just how naive those families were in thinking that the government would actually look after their interests after the explosion of that mine. And to hear them talking again and again and again about feeling deceived and feeling let down is such a common theme in my work when people deal with agencies of the state around injustice. And we know from the forestry work that we've done, out of the 900 serious harm injuries since 2008, the Crown had only taken 12 prosecutions in relation to all of those deaths. We then stepped into the space, as you would have seen, and started taking our own prosecutions, and were successful just recently in getting 2 guilty pleas for 2 forestry workers and significant reparations and fines paid. And those actions, taking up the role of the state, stepping into the shoes of the state, are part of our thinking around trade unions as public institutions. We are the push to the pull, really, in terms of making sure that working people have a voice in this country. And if you think about what are public institutions, what are their features, we are very quick to identify some of them. So we say universities are public institutions, the media, the parliament, the courts. We don't like it when our media are useless, and we have a lot of complaints, but actually what we want is good media, stronger media, better public institutions of the media. We don't like it when our universities put up their fees or have to cut back on courses, because we believe in their role in the public space and want them to be strong institutions. And we don't like it when our judges are criticised, because we want them to be able to maintain their independence, do what they think is right, and live free from criticism. Well, the same should be from unions. We are public institutions. We play a very public role, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the public roles that we play. And yet we don't get given the same sort of deference or special position that those other organisations get or can claim. And I think we need to start taking that space and pointing out the public work we do. And the reality is that 75% of Kiwis earn their income by working. They don't have any other form of income. They don't have rentals, they don't have shares, they don't have savings. In 2012, 50% of Kiwis had less than $300 in the bank. So they don't have any other form of income except what they can earn by selling their labour, selling their time, selling their effort, selling their skill. And so it's incredibly important that that ability to earn a living is preserved, and that they're able to do that safely, be paid well, get trained, be prepared for future changes in the workforce so they can move on. And that's the public space that unions fill. And It's our view at our experience of the CTU and some of these disputes that we've been running, the Hobbit dispute and the other things, that New Zealand's are really at risk of becoming a little fishing village, where the fleet owners are the only ones really allowed to have a say. If anyone in the village puts their hand up and suggests something be done differently, they're likely to be run out of town. The fishermen do all the work but have very little voice and very little control. And any strangers are also particularly suspicious and unwelcome, people that enter the village from the outside. And I think it's a very, very negative place for us to be. And we saw it with, for example, Eleanor Catton when she spoke up around after she won her book prize. She was slapped down. We've seen it with trade unionists. We see it with workers in the workplace. And my experience, because I've been unwell, is that your members see it in the hospitals as well. And the doctors that I've met, endless stream of doctors, have all got incredible stories to tell about the health system, but are often very, very afraid to talk about them or feel that they don't have a place where they can draw out these concerns that they've got. And I think it's the fishing village effect, that people are scared in this country to take an alternative voice, to take a strong voice and to speak out. And that makes unions incredibly important. 2 forestry families came with me down to Pike River. A woman whose husband was killed in the Tokoroa forest and a woman whose son was killed in Whakatane. And both of these women, we took private prosecutions for the death of their relatives. These were the 2 guilty pleas that I was talking about. And they spoke at the Pike Memorial. And we were talking about, because we drove over there together, talking about, on the way over, they were talking about how being in the union and having a voice had really changed their thinking about things, their way of life, their concept of their own power and their own skills. They'd learned to speak publicly, they'd learned to write letters, they'd learned to talk to the media, all of those things. And they were really reflecting how belonging to an institution, which was the union movement, which is the institution they've joined, has enabled them to speak up and have a say. And they've become incredibly important union allies in terms of the work we do. So the Council of Trade Unions has been trying to reach out into the public space and say we are public institutions and we want to be available for all workers and be a voice for all workers, and we want that role recognised. And we've been doing that through a whole range of activities, not just the forestry work, but we've taken a whole lot of cross-industry cases, which you might have seen, in particular the service workers have been taking them, but most recently we've won a big case on equal pay, which says that the Equal Pay Act does allow female-dominated occupations to make a pay claim using comparator occupations that are dominated by men, and that will be a significant rollout piece of work for the entire New Zealand workforce. And it's an example of trade unions doing public institutional work. So we expect to take a pay claim for the hospital staff that you work with, lots of them, but in particular the clerical staff, which is a female-dominated occupation and will be undervalued for the work that they do. But we also hope to take a case for clerical workers across the New Zealand economy, and in that way show the public institutional role of trade unions across every single workplace that employs some form of administrative staff. We've been doing, obviously as we said, we've been doing lots and lots of work on health and safety to show the public that trade unions are the public institutions that argue for safe work. And not only have we been doing forestry and pike, but we've been working with unions to make sure that they get the new law and use it to its maximum. But we've also been working with communities like the Sikh community in Auckland around the death of a young security guard. You might have seen a young security guard killed on his first night at work, Sharon Preet Dhaliwal, and we ended up representing that family, both in the agitation to get a work-safe prosecution, but also at the coroner's hearing. I was interested in the coroner's presentation that you had there. And we're still continuing to advocate for justice for Sharon Preet. So we're working on issues like equal pay that spread across the economy and influence everybody, health and safety that spread across the economy and influence everybody, and we're also working on pay. And pay, as I say, is one of the most important elements of a person's economic security, and the CTU this year is running out a pay campaign into next year, trying to join together workers across the economy to demand that wages go up. And 46% of Kiwis didn't get a pay increase last year at all, and about the same number the year before. And 50% of Kiwis now say they're struggling week to week to pay their bills on the earnings that they get. So it's an incredibly important element, and if 50% are struggling, then presumably 50% are interested in some sort of campaign to make that different. 600,000 workers are on some form of insecure employment agreement, and I'm sure there's people in this room that are on some form of insecure employment agreement. Everywhere you go, either fixed term, seasonal work, limited casual work, or 0-hour contracts with insecure hours in them. 600,000, it's an incredible number of people, and it's absolutely the natural result of a deregulated labour market, which we've got, where there's very little restriction on how you employ people in terms of permanency. And so the incentives, the levers, are to employ people in a casual type arrangement. And we've been doing a whole lot of work on 0 hours. You would have seen the Unite Unions campaign in Auckland on that, but also on the government's recent bill. The government, in response to the Unite Unions campaign, which was successful in getting McDonald's workers and Wendy's workers and Burger King workers on permanent hours, they're introducing legislation to legalise 0 hours. And they're saying it's to ban 0 hours, but actually what the law says is that you can have availability contracts provisions in your agreements. The availability provisions may have any number of hours that you have to be available, and if they're not guaranteed hours to you, so they're 0-hour contracts, you have to be paid some form of compensation. It did say reasonable compensation, but they removed the reasonable and just said compensation. So an employer could effectively offer a worker $10 a week, minimum wage, to be available 24/7, and this will now be lawful under this law. And in addition to that, an employer can restrict you taking another job under this new law for a much wider series of reasons. So it used to be very restricted when an employer could stop you taking a second job in New Zealand. The law was quite clear. People were allowed to sell their skills as long as they were delivering to you. You weren't allowed to restrict their trade with other employers. Under the new law, the employer will be able to stop you taking a second job if they would lose some competitive advantage. Even if they are offering you 0 hours, they can stop you taking a second job because of competitive advantage. And, you know, it's absolutely outrageous and imbalanced, and we're continuing to campaign against that. And it could affect some of you people as well, I imagine, if your employers decide that they want to cut down on people picking up secondary employment. This new law, genuine reasons on reasonable grounds, they can stop you doing it. And then they've added a whole lot of new grounds for that to occur. So those are the big areas of work that we think unions as a whole need to focus on in terms of public interest issues: health and safety, wages and hours, security of employment. And if you want to see a good example of why this is important, you just have to have a look at what's rolling out across the country for the New Zealand meat workforce, the AFCO workers that work in Tally's meat plants in 8 different parts of some of the poorest regions of New Zealand in the North Island. And for one of the richest families in the country, the Tally family, they've used the new government's new employment law to refuse to settle a collective employment agreement with those workers. They are seasonal workers, so they're not guaranteed employment between seasons. And on their return to work after the season, the company has offered them a new employment agreement, which includes a $100 a week reduction in their guaranteed take-home pay for the part of the season that they are working, which allows them to be rostered any time, any day, 24/7, instead of having any sort of permanent security around the rosters, which requires them to get the permission of their employer if they wish to have a meeting outside of work with any of their workmates about work issues, which stops their union fee deductions and says the company will not deduct union fees from these workers, and which basically allows workers to be engaged on any level of seniority, so not guaranteed any form of employment. They're forcing those workers to sign those agreements in order for them to come back to work. If they want a job at the beginning of the season, because the company hasn't renewed their collective, they'll be forced to take these provisions. And in 7 plants, they've taken the provisions and gone back to work. And in the Wairoa plant, they've now been locked out for weeks and weeks and weeks as they refuse to do that. 80% of the people that have a job in Wairoa work for AFCO tallies, and here they're being told, if you want to work for us, you have to sign this new agreement. And this season, it's $100 a week. What is it going to be next season, and the season after, and the season after, when they drive the union out of that plant? And those workers yesterday or the day before won a significant court case, which was fantastic, where the court finally admitted that they weren't seasonal, that in fact they were full-year workers with a part-year break, which means hopefully we can get some security, but we've still got to get a collective employment agreement with that company. And you have to ask yourself, here's one of the richest families in New Zealand seeking to take a bit more out of some of the poorest communities, using their fishing village power and the deregulated labour market to silence those workers, to stop them meeting each other, to stop them joining the union. Very clear that if one of them wrote to her local MP, they threatened to sack her. Very clear that you don't talk to people outside of the workplace to discredit the company in any way, and seeking to basically impoverish those workers even further. And so from our point of view, those workers' future destiny is linked to your future and destiny, and my future and destiny, and the country's future and destiny. If they get poorer and are treated more shabbily, they're the start of the entire meat industry going down that track. And so the role of unions in protecting them, regardless of where they're working or which union they belong to, is incredibly important, and also why we're under attack, because to get away with these sorts of changes and impositions, they need to have a weak union movement. And one of the demands of the company is that they will not negotiate with the New Zealand Meat Workers Union. They want a separate union, a new union set up to cover their workers, and they're actively working with some other social groups to set up a new union to try and split those workers into two different unions. So Ian wanted me to reflect on the role of the union movement in this sort of context and the work we're doing on public institutions. I hope you get the public institution stuff. We're writing about it, we're pushing it out there, we're arguing for it, and sitting alongside that should come some rights to be protected, to be allowed to do our thing without being pushed around, because the more we're pushed around and pushed down, the more we start to act like private institutions, the more we start to just look after our shareholders, just look after our members, just do what we need to do to survive. Whereas the more we opened up into a movement with these basic values and rights and responsibilities, the more we're able to shift the New Zealand economic and social culture. So with public institutions comes public responsibilities, and that leads into the second part, which is unions need to change as well. And we are not fit for organising workers in this country in the nature that they're working now. And if you want to look at the other campaigns we've been running, for example, with farm workers, their wages go down every year. If you ever look at the Federated Farmers Remuneration Report, which I love, it's my favourite report every year, they're working 60, 70 hours a week. They've got one of the highest accident rates in the country. Huge turnover. 70% of farmers said they spent nothing on training last year. I can't remember the exact figure, but there's this huge number of farm workers who spend no more than a year in the industry. So quite a disaster, a walking, talking disaster on all of the things I've been talking about. And the farmers hate the unions. And everything you put out there to try and help, to maybe get some codes, to try and get some changes across the industry, they resist, they attack us, and they criticise us. And do you know what the problem is we don't have a union to offer those workers. So they don't need to be so scared, because actually there is not a union in New Zealand willing to offer coverage to farm workers. And so we spit all this stuff out there about farm workers and get them all riled up, and they ring us and say, I'm glad you rang, because, I'm glad you were speaking out, because my son fell off his horse, got kicked out of his house, didn't get paid the money he was owed, lost his job, his kids lost his school, and now I've got the 2 horses in my backyard. Can you tell me what he can do? And I have to say, I'm really sorry, there isn't a union for farm workers. And that shouldn't be our response in 2015 if we want to be a social movement. And so the other thing that the union movement needs to do is change. And we're looking at this concept of being a social hub for New Zealand workers. And if you have a look at how the internet is going, there's a services hub, which you could say is Uber and Airbnb, where people go and buy particular services. And Uber are now going to get into logistics. If you want your house moved, you can click on Uber. If you want coffee delivered, you can click on Uber. If the supermarket now, instead of employing drivers to drop off your groceries, they're going to let drivers bid for the work through Uber. It's going to become the logistics system. If you want to buy something, you go to Amazon. You don't just have to buy off them, you can buy off every retailer in the world who's now selling through Amazon. They're the retail hub. We want to become the social hub in New Zealand, where people come where they need support, where they need to join progressive movements, where they want information, where they can get advice, and where they can connect up with their community of interest, whether it's truck drivers, whether it's taxi drivers, whether it's farm workers, forestry workers. And so we want to be able to say to all New Zealand workers, you are welcome. You're part of us, we represent your interests, that's our role as public institutions, and we have public protection to do that. And that requires us to change. There's lots of ideas around how that happens. We're working through those. I don't have time to go through them all with you. But the idea that we are a big player in the New Zealand civil society, I think is catching on. And somebody I sat next to on the plane should never take what someone sitting next to you on the plane the other day was saying, that the union movement is exciting at the moment. It is the movement in New Zealand doing things, pushing back, challenging, winning, taking these cases that I was talking about, not just equal pay, but about sleepovers, about women who drive home help, travel allowance, things like that. We are the organisation, the only voice in New Zealand, the only institution pushing back around health and safety, pushing back around economic development. And it is an exciting place to be, but we do need to keep changing and keep thinking about our role and keep pushing forward together as a social movement. So thanks very much.